A country in further turmoil. Kyrgyzstan's opposition said it's now in control after bloody clashes that forced the president to flee to the south of the country. Just what's behind the latest unrest? Would it spill over into neighboring countries? And are foreign hands involved? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Garda. Welcome to the program. Unhappy with the government, protests, demonstrations and violence hit Kyrgyzstan. President Kurmanbek Bakiyev has apparently left the capital and headed towards his stronghold in the south of the country. And it all looks like a repeat of what happened in 2005, which forced former President Askar Akayev to step down. That was known as the Tulip Revolution. Azhar Sukri reports on history possibly repeating itself.
Opposition supporters attacking government troops in Bishkek. They respond by firing live rounds into the crowd. Clashes broke out across the capital on Wednesday. Protesters trying to storm a government building met with tear gas and water cannon before forcing the police back. The opposition say scores of people were killed.
First it was the Akayev regime, now it's the Bakayev regime. People are unhappy. Look around here, we're all poor, no jobs. They're shooting at people, you can see for yourselves. After this, I think there'll be blood for blood.
Growing resentment over a 200% increase in fuel prices and the failed promises of President Kurmanbek Bakiyev have spilled over in recent days. The opposition say they have taken control of the government. Bakiyev came to power 5 years ago after a similar uprising. He promised to end the corruption of his predecessor, but many of Bakiyev's former supporters say that hasn't happened. Kyrgyzstan's powerful neighbour Russia says it has not had a hand in the uprising.
The only thing I can say is that neither Russia, nor your humble servant, nor Russian officials have anything to do with these events. As for me personally, the events in Kyrgyzstan have taken me by surprise.
Emergency wards in hospitals rapidly filled up with the wounded as medical workers struggled to treat them. As evening fell, fires burned in key government buildings, the focus of many of the protesters' anger. They appear to be showing no signs of backing down. Azhar Sukri, Al Jazeera.
Well, joining us to talk some more about this today from Bishkek, we have Kumar Bekbolitov, the director of the Soros Foundation in Kyrgyzstan. Alexander Pikayev joins us from Moscow, where he's a defense analyst and advisor to the Defense Committee at the State Duma. And Evan Feigenbaum, he's with us from Washington. He's from the Council on Foreign Relations and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asia as well. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Mr. Pikayev, if I could start with you. This could be the revolution within the revolution. Did you expect it?
Well, it was expected because transition of power in post-Soviet space is associated with many difficulties. So therefore, it was surprising that it happened so fast and in that brutal way. But the very fact that Mr. Bakiyev could be ousted not by a routine democratic process, but by a revolution, uprising, or some other measures, well, I think it was expected. No one expected that it would happen too soon. His predecessor was in power for 15 years, but Mr. Bakiyev, a product of Tulip Revolution, survived just for 5 years.
Evan Feigenbaum, the International Crisis Group wrote a piece in August 2008. When I'm looking at it now, it seems quite prophetic because it was called Kyrgyzstan, a deceptive calm, and it cited corruption, increasing disillusionment with politics, and a series of major economic crises. And this piece had spoken of potential eruption from the people. It has happened. Where to from here? Do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing for the country?
Well, I think, first of all, I largely share the analysis that both the crisis group and that your guest from Bishkek just elaborated. You know, this has been building up for quite some time. Kyrgyzstan is a country that's really beset by a lot of tensions, and particularly economic, social, and underlying political tensions. They've been in the elite for some time. People have been deeply dissatisfied. And frankly, it's a country that really could stand to get back to focusing on the basic economic and governance fundamentals. And so, you know, setting aside the question of what's good and bad, I think what's really needed now is a government that, in the first instance, can restore and maintain order, ultimately sets the country on a path to democracy. But what that really means is to put in place a government that is as representative as possible, but ultimately really is able to focus on many of the economic, underlying social and governance fundamentals that really have gotten lost over the last several years, but over a longer period of the history of independent Kyrgyzstan, partly through political maneuverings and the focus of the political elite in Kyrgyzstan elsewhere. But I think people have really been deeply dissatisfied and have a right to expect that their government begins to focus on those things. So that's where I hope this government, whatever it ultimately looks like, is going to go.
Kumar Bekbolitov in Bishkek, were you one of those people who was deeply dissatisfied? Do you back a change in government?
Well, I would generally align with such a position that the situation in the country warranted taking such action, but without any arms, without violence which was involved, and certainly it didn't warrant such a response from government, leaving so many people dead and so many families without their dear ones.
Who do you think started the violence, Mr. Bekbolitov?
I think the ultimate blame could be placed on how the government managed the security situation initially, what happened in Bas, one of the regions, and when it spread later on to other regions. I think by arresting almost all of the opposition leaders, the government actually opened the way for this chaotic development of the situation, which ultimately erupted into so much violence. And I think the government could have foreseen the way in which, you know, protesters could pick up guns and exchange.
Okay, we're losing you there for the second. Okay, we're losing you there for a second, Mr. Bekbolitov. I'm going to move on. Mr. Bekbolitov, I'm going to ask a question of another guest because we're losing you for the second. Hopefully we can get a stronger signal back. Let's go back to Alexander Pikayev. Do you agree? Do you think that the biggest mistake of the president, President Bakiyev, his biggest error recently was arresting all those major opposition leaders on April the 7th? Was that the straw that broke the camel's back?
Well, I believe the major problem for President Bakiyev was that he concentrated too much power, not only political but also economic, which is very important, in hands of his own family and his son Maxim, who is now, I believe, is in Washington, D.C., is probably the most hated person in Kyrgyzstan, reportedly. Maybe my Kyrgyz colleague would correct me. And the fact that presidential family concentrated so much resources, they violated, Mr. Bakiyev violated his own promises that he would provide prosperity, democracy in Kyrgyzstan. In recent months, he effectively abandoned all democratic procedures in the country. Therefore, people perceived him as a liar, and you could imagine to what kind of desperateness the people could be thrown into, that they really started this uprising against the Mr. Bakiyev administration.
Mr. Pikayev, accusations are abound of foreign hands behind the protests, maybe even Russian hands. What do you think?
Well, the whole question is that the Russians increased the price for delivered oil products to Kyrgyzstan since April 1st, and the uprise was started in April 7. Well, it's too short period of time that increase of price of Russian oil import to affect domestic Kyrgyz market. Therefore, I believe that all those accusations about Russian hand is probably exaggerated, and if there is any truth in that. Simply, I don't see any arguments which would justify, which would support
right.
that viewpoint.
Okay, we'll broaden it out a little bit later on and talk about the geopolitical strategic significance of Kyrgyzstan. But for the moment, Evan Feigenbaum, somebody that's come to the fore since these protests happened, has been Rosa Otunbayeva. What do we know about her? Tell us a little bit about her.
Well, she's somebody who's very well known to the international community. She's somebody who is a former foreign minister. She's comfortable with foreigners. She's also been involved in Kyrgyz politics for a long time. And she was a central figure in the 2005 events that produced the Tulip Revolution. The opposition in Kyrgyzstan is large. It's going to be interesting to see how they hold together or don't. You know, one of the things that's always struck me is that many of these figures in the opposition, including some that we were just talking about, who were subject to arrest in recent days, have been in and out of governments that were led by President Bakiyev. Take Almaz Atambayev, who served as President Bakiyev's prime minister, but has also been an erstwhile member of the opposition. So Kyrgyz politics are very complicated, and I think one of the things that will be interesting to watch in the next few days is, in the first instance, how that dynamic shapes up among some of these opposition leaders. But then second, of course, we haven't heard from President Bakiyev,
yes.
but we haven't heard from Mr. Bakiyev yet. And he hasn't resigned, as far as I know, and reports are that he's still in the country. He's down in the south.
Yes.
There are north-south tensions in Kyrgyzstan. They're real. They're exploited often by politicians, but they reflect, as I said, some of these underlying political, social, and economic tensions. So
yes.
One challenge that Ms. Otunbayeva is going to have is to try to set the country back on its path to sustained and stable democratic and representative government.
Yes, you mentioned the north-south tensions. Let's ask Mr. Bekbolitov about that. There is a north-south tribal dynamic, as I understand it. How strong is this dynamic? How much influence does it have, and how much support does the president have in the south, the place which he's fled to right now?
Well, I would really try to avoid the word tribal, because it's mostly about regional division that we're speaking of. But in this sense, even though Bakiyev's stronghold is in southern city of Jalalabad, I think it's very difficult to expect that the southern people, the southern electorate, is going to support Bakiyev and is going to help him restore power. I think the most telling thing is that this morning, in all of the 3 southern provinces, the governors were replaced, and the governors supported by the opposition were appointed. And even if you take the city of Jalalabad, I think there are very different dynamics there. There is an inter-ethnic component, as the city is a multi-ethnic city where both ethnic Kyrgyz and Uzbek live. And there is also a division between Bakiyev supporters and the opposition supporters inside the city. So I guess this dynamic isn't really going to pick up to be something very important in the next few days.
Well, it's good that you've spelt out some of the complexities regarding this. Let's look at another layer of complexity, which is the strategic importance of Kyrgyzstan. Located in Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan is one of the poorest countries in the region, but with a huge strategic significance. The US has a military base in Bishkek. It serves as a critical supply route for the Americans and its allies involved in Afghanistan. The Russians also have an airbase just 40 kilometers away from the American one. So what happens in Kyrgyzstan is a matter of concern for both these power blocs. In addition, stability, the spread of Islamist militancy, access to Kyrgyzstan's energy and natural resources, and trade routes are the other concerns regionally and globally. Let's bring in Alexander Pikayev. There are Russian and US bases in Kyrgyzstan. It adds to the complexity, no doubt. It also makes it all the more intriguing for the outsider when you look at the country, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's it. Kyrgyzstan is a very poor nation with a very limited amount of natural resources. Russia certainly has second thoughts about American military presence in Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia in general. I think this suspicion is also shared by the Chinese, and China is a neighboring country to Kyrgyzstan. But at the same time, Moscow supports the US-led operation in Afghanistan, and the Manas Air Force Base in Kyrgyzstan is to supply American forces in Afghanistan. So that here, on the one hand, we have a suspicion, on the other hand, we have a considerable overlap of interests. And therefore, actually, Moscow gave a green light for establishing the American military presence in Kyrgyzstan last year, when suddenly President Bakiyev decided to close the Manas US Air Force Base. Later on, obviously after certain contacts between Moscow and Washington, after the announcement of reset in the US-Russian relations, Moscow actually, I believe, did not oppose reopening of the base for the transit. But still, situation is indeed very complicated, and Moscow certainly wants to keep Kyrgyzstan as its strategic partner. Okay. President Medvedev yesterday said that Kyrgyzstan was and will be Russian strategic partner. And earlier today, Prime Minister Putin, in fact recognized interim government of Madame Otunbayeva. He had a phone conversation and offered support for the interim government.
Yes, that support
high-ranking envoy
it's certainly
will come
significant.
To Moscow.
No doubt, no doubt. Let's move on to Evan Feigenbaum. The protesters were calling for the closure of the US base in Kyrgyzstan. Surely that would be suicidal for any new leadership to actually do, wouldn't it?
Well, I don't expect that that's going to happen. And I saw that Ms. Otunbayeva had some comments to the effect that the base would continue operating. You know, there are two interesting things about the base. The first is, one of the tragedies is that the base has really become the public face of the United States in the Kyrgyz Republic. And I say that's a tragedy because while the base is important, it's certainly not the only thing that's important to the United States in Kyrgyzstan. The United States has a long history in this country and does a lot of other things there, whether it's really helping to build a national drug control agency, largely with U.S. assistance, whether it's education programs, the American University of Central Asia, hundreds of millions of dollars that have dispensed in microcredit loans with U.S. assistance, and other things too. And so unfortunately, and it's a reality, the base is the public face now of the United States, and so much else that the U.S. does that's good in this country and with this country gets lost. So that's unfortunate.
Right. Okay.
But it's a reality. And so on the base, if I could just say, you know, I don't expect the base to disappear, but I do think we need to recognize that the base has been a political football in Kyrgyzstan for a long time. Cool. When I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asia, I had a couple of near-death experiences with this base. There have been incidents and accidents and other things that have happened. And I expect that one of the challenges the United States is going to face is not just to negotiate or renegotiate, if the government seeks to do it, the terms of the base agreement, but also to persuade the Kyrgyz people that this base is in Kyrgyzstan's interests. And it's ironic that Russia and others don't share that view because
let's go
it's vital to the American effort in Afghanistan.
Okay, point made. Kumar Bekbalitov, do you concur with Evan Feigenbaum that there's more to the U.S. influence in Kyrgyzstan than just the base?
Well, definitely, but it's again ironic that, you know, in the months preceding the events of April in Kyrgyzstan, the NGOs, civil society, the media, and the opposition, they kept reminding the United States government it is the base which is keeping a great deal of criticism, which could be guided against the regime of Bakiyev, that it is the base preventing the U.S. government from such criticism. And now with the opposition in charge, it would be interesting to see what would the rhetoric be in terms of this very significant aspect of U.S.-Kyrgyz relations.
Yes, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Mr. Bekbolotov, the UN Special Envoy Jan Kubis has been deployed by Ban Ki-moon. I mean, realistically, what can he do? Because it seems, theoretically, that there's no room for compromise at this moment in time, surely?
Well, there is no room for compromise, and I think this search for compromise is coming a little too late, because pretty much everyone in this country, I think, you know, as of by end of today, it's getting quite clear that politically opposition is in charge, and the only thing is to prevent more violence. And it's very difficult to see, you know, what could the United Nations' real influence be in terms of affecting the situation in a positive way, because when, you know, last week when Mr. Ban Ki-moon, he was in Bishkek, he didn't even manage to see civil society protesters and media protesters who were trying to deliver some key messages.
Alexander Pikayev, given the neighborhood and the fact that we are talking about Central Asia, would you still term and describe Kyrgyzstan, as so many others have, in calling it the Switzerland of Central Asia? Does that label still hold?
Well, it's probably, given the landscape, given beautiful mountains, lakes, yes, Kyrgyzstan is very beautiful, so it could be compared with Switzerland of Central Asia, but the problem is that it's very poor Switzerland and has so many complications which I think Switzerland managed hundreds years ago.
Okay, final question to Evan Feigenbaum. Is there the possibility at all, in your opinion, that any of this could spill over into the neighborhood, into other Central Asian countries?
Well, I think Central Asian countries and the neighboring governments, not least the governments of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, will be working overtime to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so I would expect that there's a lot of concern in other capitals around the region about what's happening. And I think they're going to do everything that they possibly can politically and with the security forces that they have along borders and so on to make sure that doesn't happen. I'm sure that's a preoccupation for them.
Gentlemen, it's been intriguing and educational speaking to all of you from Bishkek, Moscow and Washington, D.C. Kumar Bekbolotov, Alexander Pikayev and Evan Feigenbaum. Great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for joining us here on Inside Story. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on this episode of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments, your suggestions or your questions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye-bye.